The radio crackled, spitting out the static-laced sounds of dying men. Down in the basin, 4 Navy SEALs were pinned by heavy machine gun fire, bleeding into the dust. They had maybe 3 minutes left. Above them, hidden in the shale, a lone woman chambered around. Her hands shook. The rock beneath Riley Foster's sternum felt like a griddle left on a high burner. It was 112 degrees in the valley, and the heat radiated upward through the jagged shale, baking the moisture out of her skin. She had been lying in the exact same position for 7 hours. Her lips were cracked, splitting down the middle, tasting faintly of copper and old salt. A single persistent horsefly kept landing on the bridge of her nose, right where the sweat pooled before dripping onto the rubber eyepiece of her scope. She didn't swat it. She didn't blink. She breathed in slow, letting her diaphragm expand against the hot stone. Exhaled. Through the magnified circle of her optic, the world was a distorted, shimmering nightmare of heat mirages. 400 yards down the slope, the dry riverbed twisted like a dead snake. That was where her team was. Donovan, Griggs, Perez, Miller. 4 men wrapped in desert camouflage, currently pinned behind the rusted, hollowed-out carcass of a Soviet-era transport truck. It wasn't supposed to be an ambush. It was supposed to be a standard reconnaissance movement. But the valley had teeth. The first indication of trouble hadn't been a gunshot. It was the sudden, unnatural silence of the cicadas, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel echoing from the ridgeline opposite Foster's position. Then the rhythmic, deafening thud-thud-thud of a DSHK heavy machine gun tearing the morning apart. Now the air was thick with the smell of pulverized rock and cordite. The enemy had them triangulated. Foster could see the muzzle flashes winking from 3 separate elevations across the basin. The gunfire wasn't cinematic. It didn't sound like the crisp cracks in movies. It was a chaotic, overlapping roar, a mechanical tearing sound that vibrated in Foster's molars. Every time the heavy gunner tracked across the rusted truck, chunks of metal and sand exploded into the air, showering Donovan and his men in a blinding cloud of debris. Foster swallowed. Her throat clicked bone dry. "Overwatch, this is actual—" Donovan's voice scratched through her earpiece. It sounded terribly small, stripped of its usual bravado. "We are black on water, red on ammo. Pinned down by heavy suppression from the east ridge. Can you get an angle on that, Dushka?" Foster shifted her rifle, the heavy barrel scraping a fraction of an inch across the sandbag she had fashioned from an extra shirt. Her shoulder throbbed. On the insertion 2 nights ago, she had slipped on a loose scree slope and wrenched her rotator cuff. It was a dull, hot ache that spiked into blinding agony every time she pulled the rifle tight into her pocket. She ignored it. You didn't complain about a shoulder when your team was being chewed to pieces in a valley. She panned the scope. The east ridge was a jumble of shadows and boulders. She found the DSHK. It was nested deep inside a natural cave formation shielded by a lip of granite. The gunner was practically invisible, save for his elbows and the continuous blinding flashes from the barrel. "Negative actual," Foster whispered. Her voice was raspy. "He's defilade. I have no shot on the heavy gun." A pause on the radio. Just the sound of automatic fire chewing through the truck door. "Understood," Donovan said. A beat. "We're going to break cover and bound to the drainage ditch on the south side. Cover us." Donovan, wait. Foster started panic, flaring cold in her gut. The drainage ditch was 80 yards away. Open ground. It was suicide, but they had no choice. The truck was literally disintegrating. Another burst from the heavy machine gun sheared the front axle off, dropping the chassis a foot into the dirt. Griggs scrambled backward, clutching his helmet, as a ricochet screamed off the metal inches from his face. Foster felt a sickening lurch of impotence. This was the reality of the job. It wasn't about heroism, it was about geometry, timing, and dumb luck. Right now, the geometry was fucked. Their timing was gone, and luck had abandoned them an hour ago. She felt the urge to vomit. Her hands, encased in fingerless gloves, felt clammy and thick. She gripped the stock of her rifle tighter, trying to ground herself in the texture of the stippled polymer. It felt solid. Real. She forced herself to detach. Emotions get you killed, the instructors had drilled into them. Do the math. She checked her turrets. Windage, elevation. The wind was quartering from her left, maybe 6 miles per hour, kicking up tiny dust devils on the valley floor. Distance was 420 yards. She dialed the dope. Moving! Donovan yelled over the comms. Through the scope, Foster watched the men break cover. It was an ugly, desperate scramble. No elegant bounding. Just 4 exhausted, terrified human beings running for their lives through a hailstorm of lead. Instantly, the opposing ridgeline lit up. The heavy gun swiveled, tracking the movement. Dust erupted in violent geysers around Perez's boots. Foster's finger found the trigger. The metal was scalding hot. She didn't have a shot on the heavy gun, but she saw a secondary shooter, a man with an AK-47 rising from behind a boulder to get a better angle on the sprinting SEALs. She tracked him. The crosshairs settled on the center of his chest, a faded green tactical vest. She didn't think about his life. She didn't think about politics or the war or the absolute absurdity of dying in this nameless dirt crater. She just thought about the wind. Hold left edge. She pressed the trigger straight to the rear. The rifle bucked violently against her injured shoulder, a concussive shockwave punching the air out of her lungs. The crack of the shot rolled across the valley, a sharp, solitary whip crack cutting through the automatic fire. Through the scope, she watched the man in the green vest fold. He didn't fly backward. He simply collapsed, dead weight, tumbling over the boulder like a sack of wet cement. One down, but the heavy gun didn't stop. And Perez was falling. It happened in slow motion, yet too fast for Foster to process. Perez, sprinting near the rear of the formation, jerked violently to the right. A spray of pink mist hung in the dry air for a microsecond before the wind pulled it apart. He crashed into the dirt, face first, his rifle clattering away over the rocks. "Man down, Perez is hit!" Griggs's voice screamed over the radio, the audio peaking into a shrill screech. Griggs stopped running. He turned back, grabbing Perez by the drag handle of his plate carrier. Donovan and Miller laid down covering fire, but it was useless. The DSK was eating the ground around them, the massive 12.7mm rounds, kicking up clods of earth the size of cinder blocks. They were stranded in the open. Foster racked the bolt of her rifle. The spent brass casing ejected, pinging off the rock beside her ear. It smelled of burnt gunpowder and ozone. She shoved another round into the chamber. Her breathing was ragged now. She was losing control of her heart rate. The thumping in her chest was so violent it made the crosshairs bounce. "Breathe, you stupid bitch, breathe." She swore at herself silently, squeezing her eyes shut for a fraction of a second. She opened them. She had to stop that heavy gun. If she didn't, Donovan, Griggs, Perez, and Miller would be dead in under 60 seconds. The truck was no longer an option. The drainage ditch was too far. They were pinned in the open dirt, clustered together, a perfect target. She swung the muzzle back to the cave formation. The gunner was still obscured, tucked behind the granite lip. But Foster noticed something else. Something she had missed in her initial scan. Above the cave, the rock face was fractured. Massive, jagged slabs of shale jutted out over the lip, precariously balanced, weakened by centuries of wind and erosion. It was a stupid idea. It was a desperate one-in-a-million cinematic trope of an idea, and she hated herself for even considering it. Bullets don't shatter boulders like in the movies. But she wasn't shooting an M4. She was shooting a .338 Lapua Magnum. It fired a massive heavy projectile meant to punch through engine blocks at a mile out. She adjusted her bipod, raising the muzzle slightly. The crosshairs climbed the rock face, settling on a deep fissure at the base of the overhanging slab. "Actual, hold your position." Foster keyed the mic. "Keep your heads down." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't calculate the wind this time. She just relied on muscle memory and desperation. Crack. The rifle kicked. Foster forced her eye to stay in the scope, fighting the recoil. The massive round slammed into the fissure. A puff of grey dust erupted from the rock. Nothing else happened. The heavy gun kept firing. Foster gritted her teeth, racking the bolt so hard she tore a layer of skin off her knuckles on the optic mount. She ignored the sting. She chambered another round. Crack. She hit the exact same spot. Another puff of dust. The fissure widened, a tiny spiderweb of cracks appearing in the magnified glass. "Overwatch, whatever you're doing, it's not working!" Donovan yelled. Over the comms, Foster could hear Perez screaming in agony. It was a guttural, wet sound. He was hit in the lung. "We are getting torn apart down here." Foster's vision tunneled. The periphery of her sight went black. The world shrunk to the diameter of her scope, to the tiny, jagged crack in the rock face. Her injured shoulder screamed in protest as she pulled the rifle impossibly tight into the socket, locking her body down. She needed maximum stability. She had 3 rounds left in the magazine. She didn't fire slowly. She abandoned sniper doctrine. She racked and fired as fast as she could cycle the heavy bolt, turning the precision weapon into a battering ram. Crack, crack, crack. 3 rounds spaced less than a second apart, slamming into the weakened structural fault of the granite overhang. For a terrifying second, there was only the deafening roar of the DSHK below. Foster's heart sank. She had failed. She was going to watch them die. A hollow, yawning emptiness opened in her stomach. It was the absolute crushing certainty of failure. Then the mountain groaned. It wasn't a loud sound, but a deep structural vibration that Foster felt through the stone against her chest. The spiderweb cracks on the overhang suddenly connected. With a sound like thunder, a slab of rock, the size of a minivan, detached from the cliff face. It didn't fall cleanly. It slid grinding against the bedrock, kicking up a massive cloud of choking brown dust before plummeting downward. It slammed into the granite lip of the cave. The impact was cataclysmic. The DSHK stopped firing, instantly cut off mid-burst. A massive plume of pulverized rock and dirt billowed out from the cave entrance, obscuring the entire east ridge in a dense, impenetrable cloud of debris. Silence slammed into the valley. It was so sudden, so profound, that Foster's ears rang loudly with tinnitus. She lay frozen, her finger resting lightly against the trigger guard. The bolt was locked back on an empty chamber. The smell of hot metal and sweat was overpowering. A bead of sweat broke free from her eyebrow and stung her eye, but she didn't blink. Down in the basin, the dust began to settle. "Donovan!" Foster whispered into the mic. Her voice cracked. She sounded small, terrified. "Donovan, report." Static hissed. "Actual is..." "We're up." Donovan's voice came back, accompanied by heavy, ragged breathing. "Perez is breathing. We've got him. Holy shit, Overwatch. What did you do?" Foster didn't answer. She let her head drop until her forehead rested against the hot sandbag. She closed her eyes. She wasn't relieved. She just felt deeply, profoundly hollowed out. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably now, vibrating against the stock of the empty rifle. She hadn't saved them out of heroism. She had saved them because she was terrified of being the last one left alive in this God-forsaken dirt. "Get to the extraction point." Foster finally keyed the mic, pushing herself up onto her elbows. Her shoulder flared with white-hot pain. "I'm coming down." Breaking down the rifle was an exercise in localized torture. Every time Foster rotated her right shoulder to collapse the bipod legs, a sharp, white-hot wire of agony threaded from her collarbone up into her jaw. She didn't grunt. She just bit down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted iron. She shoved the heavy suppressor into her pack, the scorched metal instantly burning through the nylon lining. She didn't care. She slung the pack over her good shoulder, grabbed her M4 from where it lay in the dust, and began the descent. There was no tactical grace to her movement. The scree slope was steep and unstable. Adrenaline was leaving her system in sickening, icy waves, leaving her muscles feeling like waterlogged wood. Twice her boots lost purchase on the loose shale, sending her sliding on her back. The sharp rocks tore at her uniform, scraping long, angry welts across her elbows and thighs. The dust she kicked up coated her throat, making her cough a dry, hacking sound that felt incredibly loud in the sudden, eerie quiet of the valley. It took her 12 minutes to reach the basin. It felt like hours. As she closed the distance to the destroyed Soviet truck, the smell hit her. It wasn't just the acrid chemical stink of burnt cordite anymore. It was the heavy metallic stench of fresh blood pooling in hot dirt. It smelled like loose change left in a sweaty palm. "Foster, over here!" Donovan hissed from the far side of the chassis. She rounded the crumpled bumper. The scene was a chaotic, bloody mess. Perez was flat on his back, his plate carrier ripped open. His face was the color of wet ash. His mouth hung open, his lips pulling back over his teeth in a grimace of pure, unadulterated shock. With every shallow, stuttering breath, he took a sickening, wet, whistling sound bubbled from a hole just below his right clavicle. Griggs was kneeling beside him, his hands coated to the wrists in dark crimson. He was fumbling with a plastic wrapper, his fingers trembling so violently he couldn't tear the notch. Miller was 10 feet away, pulling security with his rifle aimed at the dust cloud still settling over the east ridge, but his eyes kept darting back to Perez. He looked terrified. "I can't get the seal open!" Griggs stammered, his voice cracking. "My hands are there, slipping." Foster dropped to her knees in the dirt. Her knees banged hard against a stray rock, but she barely registered it. She didn't feel a surge of heroic calm. She felt a profound, ugly irritation. She hated this. She hated the vulnerability, the wetness of the blood, the fragile mechanics of the human body breaking down in front of her. "Give it to me." She snapped, her voice hoarse. She snatched the high-fin vent wrapper from Griggs. She didn't bother trying to use her fingertips. She bit the plastic notch with her teeth, ripping it sideways and tearing the wrapper in half. She pulled out the sticky, transparent chest seal. "Hold him down," she ordered. "When I put this on, he's going to panic." "He's barely conscious," Griggs argued, wiping a bloody hand across his forehead, smearing crimson into his sweat. "Just hold his shoulders, Griggs." Foster leaned over Perez. The hole in his chest was bubbling a frothy mixture of air and blood, pumping out with every failing breath. Tension pneumothorax. His lung was collapsing and the trapped air was crushing his heart. She didn't have gauze to wipe the site clean, so she used the cuff of her own filthy sleeve, swiping the pooling blood away in one rough motion. Before it could well up again, she slapped the adhesive seal over the wound, centering the plastic vent directly over the hole. Perez's eyes flew wide open. The pupils were fully dilated, 2 black pits of panic. He let out a strangled, gurgling shriek and convulsed violently, his back arching off the dirt. "Hold him!" Foster yelled. Griggs threw his weight over Perez's chest, pinning him. Foster pressed the edges of the seal down hard, sealing the adhesive against the sweat-slick skin. "Roll him. Check for an exit." They shoved Perez onto his side, a loose dead weight. Foster ran a gloved hand down the back of his shirt. It came away soaked, but she didn't find a second hole. The heavy 12.7mm round hadn't hit him directly. If it had, it would have severed his torso. It was a ricochet, a jagged piece of spalled metal or rock that had acted like shrapnel. "No exit," she said, letting him roll back onto his back. Perez's breathing changed. The wet whistling stopped. The one-way valve on the plastic seal was working, letting the trapped air escape without letting new air in. His chest rose and fell with a fraction more rhythm. Foster sat back on her heels. Her hands were covered in Perez's blood. It felt tacky, drying rapidly in the baking heat. She stared at her palms for a long second, feeling a bizarre urge to wipe them in the dirt, like a kid trying to get mud off. "Good work," Donovan said. He was crouching nearby, scanning the ridgeline. His face was tight drawn. "But we can't stay here. That rockfall bought us time, but it won't keep them down forever. If they have mortars, we're in a bucket." "Exfil is 2 clicks south," Miller said, his voice tight. "Through the drainage ditch and up the wadi. We can't carry him that far, not with gear." "We're not leaving gear." Griggs snapped, defensive. "We leave his plates," Foster said flatly. She didn't look at Griggs. She reached down and began unclipping the quick-release buckles on Perez's tactical vest. "Drop his helmet. Empty his mags into our dump pouches. We lighten him by 40 pounds, or he dies here." It was a cold calculus, the kind of math that looked terrible on paper back in a sterile briefing room, but made absolute sense in the dirt. You strip the dying man of his armor so you can carry him faster. Nobody argued. The sound of Velcro tearing and nylon unsnapping filled the quiet. They worked fast, stripping the wounded man down to his uniform. "We need a drag litter," Donovan muttered, looking around at the blasted remnants of the truck. "No time to build one," Foster said. She grabbed the reinforced drag handle on the back of Perez's plate carrier, the only piece of his harness they had left on him. She pulled it tight. 2 on the drag, 2 pulling security. We switch every 200 yards. She looked at Griggs. "You and me first." Griggs nodded, his face pale. He grabbed the other side of the nylon handle. "On 3. Foster said. She planted her boots in the loose gravel. Her right shoulder pulsed with a sick, deep throb. She ignored it. 1, 2, 3. They hauled upward. Perez groaned, a horrible wet sound from deep in his throat as his dead weight came off the ground. Foster's muscles screamed. Her torn rotator cuff felt like it was tearing further, the fibers parting like cheap cotton. She gritted her teeth, locking her arm straight to rely on bone rather than muscle. "Move," Donovan ordered. They started walking backward, dragging their bleeding teammate toward the drainage ditch. The valley was utterly silent now, save for the crunch of their boots and the ragged, desperate sound of their own breathing. It felt like walking through a graveyard, waiting for the dead to wake up. The heat inside the drainage ditch was a physical weight. It was a deep, V-shaped gouge in the earth carved by flash floods 1,000 years ago, lined with smooth, blindingly white stones that reflected the midday sun straight into their retinas. The air was entirely still down here. It felt like the inside of a kiln. They had been moving for 45 minutes. They had covered barely half a mile. Foster's hands were numb. The nylon drag handle had dug so deeply into her palm that it felt like it was cutting through the glove to the bone. Every time Perez's boots snagged on a rock, the jarring stop sent a shockwave up her arm, settling as a spike of nausea in her stomach. "Switch," Donovan gasped from behind her. Foster dropped the handle instantly. She didn't try to ease Perez down. She just let go. He slumped into the dirt with a soft thud. She stepped back, her chest heaving, leaning her weight against the sloping dirt wall of the ditch. Her thighs trembled uncontrollably. She watched Miller and Donovan take her and Griggs's places at the drag handle, their uniforms stained dark with sweat and Perez's blood. Griggs moved up to take point. His rifle raised, his eyes scanning the lip of the ditch. Foster fell in behind him, pulling rear security. She brought her M4 up to her shoulder. The movement was clumsy. Her right arm felt completely disconnected from her brain, a useless slab of aching meat. She had to use her left hand to physically hoist the rifle stock into the pocket of her shoulder. She hated this. She hated the romanticized bullshit they sold back home about this job. There was no brotherhood in the heat of the ditch. There was no noble sacrifice. There was only the brutal mechanical reality of friction, gravity, and exhaustion. She looked at Perez's face as they dragged him past her. His skin was turning a sickly, translucent yellow. His eyes were closed. The hyphen vent on his chest clicked wetly with every shallow breath. He was dying. They were breaking their bodies to carry a corpse. The thought made her feel deeply, unspeakably guilty, but she couldn't banish it. It was just a fact. Keep moving. She croaked, her throat so dry it felt lined with sandpaper. They marched another 100 yards. The walls of the ditch began to shallow out the protective dirt banks, dropping from chest height to waist height. They were losing their cover. "Banks are dropping," Griggs warned over his shoulder. "We're going to be exposed on the west flank." "No choice! Keep pushing!" Donovan grunted, straining against Perez's weight. Foster swept her rifle muzzle across the western lip. The landscape beyond the ditch was a flat, featureless expanse of scrub brush and baked earth. The heat mirage made the horizon ripple like water. It was impossible to see anything clearly. Then the air cracked. It wasn't the deafening roar of the heavy machine gun. It was a single sharp pop, followed instantly by the supersonic snap of a bullet passing terrifyingly close to Foster's ear. "Contact left!" Griggs screamed, dropping to his knees. Donovan and Miller didn't hesitate. They dropped Perez and threw themselves flat into the dirt, their rifles coming up. Foster hit the deck hard. Her injured shoulder slammed against a smooth stone, and a flash of blinding white light exploded behind her eyes. Bile rose in the back of her throat. For 3 seconds she couldn't breathe, paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming agony. Another shot rang out. A puff of dust exploded from the rim of the ditch, inches from Griggs's helmet. Sniper, or a designated marksman. Foster forced her eyes open. She blinked away the tears of pain. She didn't feel a surge of adrenaline. She felt a deep, exhausted rage. She just wanted it to stop. She just wanted to lie in the dirt and sleep. She pushed the thought away. She forced her left hand to grip the handguard of her rifle. She crawled up the sloping bank, keeping her profile as low as possible until she could see over the lip of the ditch. "Distance!" Donovan barked, firing a short blind burst into the scrub brush to keep the shooter's head down. "I don't know." Foster rasped. She pressed her eye to her optic. The 4-power scope was smeared with dust and sweat. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her vision. The heat haze was atrocious. Everything looked like it was underwater. Pop! A bullet thudded into the dirt bank 2 feet below her chest. The shooter had spotted her. She didn't flinch. The fear had burned out, replaced by a cold, mathematical focus. She scanned the terrain. No muzzle flash. The guy was using a flash hider, or he was shooting from deep cover. She looked for secondary indicators. Dust kick-up. Movement in the brush. There. 300 yards out. A slight disturbance in the heat mirage. A patch of shadow under a twisted dead acacia tree that didn't match the angle of the sun. 300 yards. 10 o'clock. Base of the dead tree. Foster called out. "Suppressing!" Miller yelled. He opened up, emptying half a magazine into the brush around the tree. Foster didn't wait to see if Miller hit anything. She settled her crosshairs on the dark patch. Her breathing was ragged. Her shoulder was screaming. Her hands were shaking. She wasn't a machine. She was a broken, bleeding human being, trying to hold a piece of metal still. She squeezed the trigger. The M4 kicked against her bad shoulder, a sharp jab of pain. Through the scope she saw the shadow under the tree jerk violently. A figure in brown robes half rose from the dirt, stumbled backward and collapsed into the scrub brush. "Target down," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. Silence returned to the basin. Just the ringing in their ears and the wet, clicking sound of Perez's chest seal. "Clear?" Donovan asked, panting heavily. "Clear for now," Foster replied. She didn't take her eyes off the optic. She waited 10 seconds. Nothing moved. She slid back down the dirt bank, landing heavily on her backside. She let the rifle drop across her lap. She looked at her hands. They were trembling worse than before. "Get up!" Donovan said, his voice cracking with exhaustion. He grabbed Perez's drag handle. "We have a mile left. We don't stop again." Foster looked at Donovan. His eyes were bloodshot, his face caked in dirt and despair. He looked exactly how she felt. There was no glory here, just the agonizing, tedious labor of survival. She nodded once. She forced herself to her feet, slung her rifle, and grabbed the drag handle next to Miller. "1, 2, 3, she whispered. They heaved and began to drag the dying man forward again, step by agonizing step under the blinding, indifferent sun. Time stopped functioning as a linear concept. It became measured entirely by the brutal rhythmic scraping of Perez's boots dragging through the gravel. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. With every heave, the heels of his boots dug twin furrows into the baked earth. By the time they reached the final quarter mile, the rubber soles had worn completely through. They were dragging him on the exposed, bloody fabric of his socks. Foster didn't look back at him anymore. She couldn't. If she looked at his face, grey and slack, she would have to acknowledge the dark, terrible thought festering in the back of her exhausted mind. Just stop breathing. It was an ugly, monstrous thought, and she hated herself for it. But it was there, whispering under the roar of blood in her ears. If Perez died, they could stop pulling. They could drop the nylon handle, sit in the shade of the ditch, and drink water. They wouldn't have to carry the dead weight of a corpse. They could just survive. The guilt of the thought made her physically sick. She punished herself for it by gripping the handle harder, wrapping the nylon strap around her wrist so tightly it cut off the circulation to her fingers. Her right shoulder had gone completely numb, the nerves overloaded and finally shutting down, replaced by a cold, heavy deadness that spread down to her elbow. Her body was eating itself, burning muscle for fuel running on the toxic fumes of adrenaline and spite. "Wadi." Donovan gasped from the front. "I see it. 300 meters. The extraction point wasn't a fortress. It was just a slightly wider, flatter section of the dry riverbed, marked by a cluster of dead, white-barked scrub trees. It offered zero cover. Just a bowl of dust waiting for a helicopter. They reached the edge of the clearing and collapsed. It wasn't a tactical halt. Their bodies simply refused to take another step. Foster dropped the handle and fell onto her back. The shale bit into her spine, but she didn't care. She stared straight up into the bleached, merciless sky. There wasn't a single cloud. Just an endless, burning expanse of blue. "Check his seal!" Donovan wheezed, rolling onto his side to cover the northern ridge with his rifle. Griggs crawled over to Perez. He looked like a ghoul. His face was coated in a thick mask of pale dust, streaked with dark tracks where sweat had cut through. He ripped Perez's uniform shirt open wider. "It's clogged." Griggs panicked, his voice a dry croak. "The blood coagulated in the vent. He's not venting." Perez was suffocating again. His lips were turning a distinct dark purple. His chest heaved spasmodically, but no air was moving. Foster forced herself to sit up. The world tilted violently on its axis, spinning in a nauseating circle before settling. "Burp it," she slurred. Her tongue felt swollen, too big for her mouth. "Peel the edge. Let the air out." Griggs dug a filthy, blood-stained fingernail under the edge of the high-fin adhesive. He ripped it back. A sickening hiss of trapped air escaped, carrying the heavy metallic stench of dark blood. Perez's back instantly relaxed, dropping flat against the dirt. Griggs pressed the seal back down, his hands trembling violently. "Where is the bird?" Miller demanded, staring at the empty sky. His voice was bordering on hysterical. "They said 10 minutes. It's been 20. "Shut up and pull security!" Donovan snapped. They waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. The silence in the wadi was absolute, heavy and oppressive. Foster lay in the dirt, her rifle resting across her thighs, her finger hovering near the trigger guard. She realized with a profound sense of detachment that if the enemy crested the ridge right now, she wouldn't even try to stand up. She would just shoot from her back until the magazine was empty. Then she felt it. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a vibration, a low, rhythmic thumping that transferred through the bedrock, shivering up her spine. "Dust off." Griggs sobbed. It was an actual sob, a wet, ugly sound of pure relief. A shadow fell over the wadi. The HH-60 Pavehawk crested the southern ridge, hugging the terrain so tightly its wheels nearly clipped the scrub brush. It came in fast and flared hard, the massive rotors beating the air into submission. The rotor wash hit them like a physical blow. A blinding, choking hurricane of sand gravel and pulverized dead leaves exploded outward. Foster squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face away as the pebbles sand-blasted her exposed skin. The noise was deafening, drowning out thought, drowning out the war. Through the swirling brown chaos, the side door slid open. 2 flight medics leaped out before the skids even touched the dirt. They wore sterile olive-drab flight suits and dark visors. They looked like aliens descending into a primitive, bloody hell. They didn't speak. They didn't ask questions. They unfolded a rigid pole litter, shoved Griggs out of the way, and rolled Perez onto the canvas in one fluid, practiced motion. Foster watched them lock the straps over Perez's chest. They moved with a clinical efficiency that felt entirely disconnected from the agonizing, filthy reality of the last 2 hours. To the medics, Perez was a package. To the team, he was 190 pounds of suffering they had dragged through the dirt. "Go, go!" The crew chief screamed from the door, waving them in. Donovan grabbed Griggs by the vest and hauled him toward the bird. Miller followed. Foster was the last one up. She slung her rifle and stumbled toward the open door, the rotor wash threatening to knock her flat with every step. She grabbed the metal frame of the door, her boots slipping on the metal deck, slick with hydraulic fluid and old blood. A hand reached out and hauled her inside. She collapsed onto the canvas jump seat, her chest heaving. The helicopter banked violently, lifting away from the wadi before the medics even had Perez fully secured to the floor mounts. The noise inside the cabin was a dull, thrumming roar. The air smelled sharply of aviation fuel, antiseptic, and sweat. Foster sat slumped against the aluminum bulkhead. Across the cabin, Griggs was staring blankly at his blood-soaked hands. Donovan had his head between his knees. Foster looked down at Perez. The medic had already started a fresh IV, squeezing a bag of saline into the line. The monitor above his head beeped steadily. He was alive. They had done it, but as the helicopter climbed higher, leaving the baking oven of the valley behind, Foster didn't feel a rush of victory. There was no swelling music, no profound sense of accomplishment. She just felt an echoing hollow ache in her bones. She closed her eyes, resting her head against the vibrating metal wall, and listened to the steady, indifferent rhythm of the rotors, taking them back to base, knowing tomorrow they would have to do it all over again. If this raw, unfiltered look at the reality of combat struck a chord with you, hit that like button and share the video with someone who appreciates gritty, grounded storytelling. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell notifications so you never miss our weekly deep dives into the minds of those on the front lines. Drop a comment below. How would you have handled the pressure in Foster's boots? Stay grounded, stay safe, and we'll see you in the next one.